Jacob tricked his dad Isaac into bestowing the birthright blessing on Jacob. Some claim that Jacob's deceit proves that prophets are imperfect, and we are therefore justified in mistrusting the first presidency. Is that right? Furthermore, does Jacob's deceit mean I can lie too?
You're a liar! You're a liar!
Let's talk about that. Similar arguments are made about other scriptural events, such as the 116 pages and Abraham lying about his wife being his sister. We made a separate video about each of those events and their implications, which you can check out if you're interested. In this brief video, we will focus only on Jacob's deceit, and we won't get into the details of any particular statement by a later first presidency. In this video, we will focus on two questions. First, whether Jacob's lie was a sin. I'm not sure I have the answer, but I'd like to propose some points for consideration. Second, if one determines that Jacob's deceit was a sin, does that justify disregarding the first presidency? Before jumping into our two questions, let's review the story, the details of Jacob's deceit. In Genesis 25, Rebekah inquired of the Lord while pregnant with twins and was told that, quote, "the elder shall serve the younger," end quote. Later, Esau sells his birthright to Jacob for bread and pottage. We're told, quote, "Esau despised his birthright," end quote. In Genesis 27, Isaac is old and, quote, "his eyes were dim so that he could not see," end quote. Isaac desires to bless Esau before he dies and asks Esau to prepare savory meat for him. Then Isaac's wife Rebekah tells their son Jacob, quote, "obey my voice according to that which I command thee," end quote. And she plans to prepare the meat herself and have Jacob deliver it as though he were Esau, so that Isaac will bless Jacob instead. Jacob expresses concerns that his father will not be fooled because Esau is hairy, and his deceit will bring a curse instead of a blessing. Rebekah responds, quote, "upon me be thy curse, my son, only obey my voice," end quote. Rebekah prepares the meat and places goat skins on Jacob so that he would feel hairy. When Isaac asks Jacob who he is, Jacob twice lies and says he is Esau. And the hairy goat skin trick, in fact, fools Isaac. So Isaac blesses Jacob. Esau later arrives and Isaac realizes that he had blessed Jacob. At Esau's pleading, Isaac gives Esau a lesser blessing. But the story does not end there. In Genesis 28, Isaac blesses Jacob again, but without any deceit involved, including expressly giving, quote, "the blessing of Abraham," end quote. And then the Lord personally pronounces the blessing on Jacob. We see this in Genesis 28, 12 through 15. Among other things, the Lord says, quote, "in thee and in thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed," end quote. And the Lord renews it again in Genesis 35. Having covered that background, let's get into the first main question. Was Jacob's deceit sinful? Unlike the 116 pages, the scriptures do not tell us that Jacob's deceit was a sin, but it seems to be commonly assumed. Deceit or lying is wrong. Jacob lied, so Jacob was wrong. Simple. Except it's not that simple. Anecdotally, most of us regularly do things to deceive people who we think might take advantage of us, like leave the porch light on when we're out of town. We do that all the time, and we still attest to our bishop that we strive to be honest in all that we do in our temple recommend interviews. Of course, in the scriptures, we are repeatedly commanded not to lie. No doubt that's the general rule. But there are exceptions in the scriptures. In our video about Abraham's lie, when he said his wife was his sister, we detailed several exceptions with facts similar to Abraham, where the Lord assisted with, approved, or commanded deceit. This includes one instance where the Lord commanded Abraham to lie. The Hebrew midwives who lied to Pharaoh about not killing newborns. and the Lord blessed them for lying, and Rahab lying about Joshua's spies. We also saw examples where there's no express reference to the Lord commanding or assisting or blessing, but it feels like the lie is appropriate, like the Ammonites deceiving Lamanites in defensive war, or people hiding Jews from Nazis. The specific application we made in the Abraham video, where the choice is between lying and killing, does not apply here. Those aren't our facts. But a more general point from those scriptural precedents is absolutely relevant. That is, sometimes deceit is not sinful. I think we need to acknowledge that to judge Jacob righteously. And in the case of Jacob, I can't find clear, analogous scriptural precedents like there are for Abraham. It's clear to me that lying is not always a sin, but Jacob's case presents unique facts. At this point, the best I can do is present some considerations that I think are relevant to weighing Jacob's deceit. First, it's relevant that in Genesis 28, Isaac again blesses Jacob. And it's relevant that the Lord twice appeared to Jacob and renewed the blessing. Also, it seems important that Jacob's deceit was instructed by his mother, Rebekah. She tells her son to obey her commands. She said any curse would be upon her. Jacob had to choose between deceiving his father and disobeying a command from his mother. That is much more morally complicated than just considering whether it is okay to lie in the abstract, or considering the common and frankly obvious fact patterns I face, like, is it okay to lie because I'm too proud to admit I was wrong? Or because I don't want to face the consequences of my actions, or because I want gain? Those are nothing like Jacob's situation. I might still conclude that Jacob was wrong, that he should have disobeyed Rebekah to avoid lying, but I should at least take into account Rebekah's role and those later renewal of blessings when I'm considering Jacob. Because it's important to our judgment of Jacob, let's look more closely at Rebekah. Did she sin? On the one hand, the record is clear that she intentionally deceived and ordered deceit. On the other hand, the Lord had revealed to her, before her twins were born, that the elder should serve the younger. Though not expressly stated, it seems to me that Rebekah interpreted this to mean that Jacob should have the blessing. And we don't know whether Rebekah or Isaac was aware that Esau despised his birthright and sold it to Jacob. But that certainly would have reinforced Rebekah's conviction if she had known. And let's not relegate Rebekah to some lesser role. She was Isaac's equal partner in the family order. And I don't mean to denigrate Isaac. It seems that Isaac either wasn't ever aware of the revelation to Rebekah, or he had forgotten it or couldn't comprehend it in his current condition. There's no evidence at all that he was intentionally undermining the Lord's will, and his later blessing supports that. Now, I might think that Rebekah should have found another way to fulfill the Lord's revelation without deceit. Like, she should have tried talking to Isaac, or prayed for an angel to intervene, or something. But I'm actually in a really poor position to know that she didn't try those options. In any event, it seems relevant that Rebekah's heart seemed to be in the right place, or at least not the place from which I usually lie. It seems to me that she wasn't lying out of pride, selfishness, or rebellion. She was lying to fulfill revelation. Look, I might still conclude that Rebekah sinned. My point here is that I can't judge her fairly without weighing the revelation she received and the seeming intent of her deceit to fulfill it. A few quick caveats to this analysis. To be clear, I'm not saying it's okay, or that this account teaches that it's okay, for us to lie in pursuit of a good outcome, that the ends necessarily justify the means. Sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't, and that's too complicated an issue to take up here. Second, Jacob's case is almost entirely anomalous. Whether you decide he sinned or did not sin, the context of his deceit, in my opinion, is so foreign that I think it's inapplicable to our world. At least in the Western world, there's no traditional concept of the oldest child, or any particular child, necessarily receiving a greater inheritance than the others. And none of us are involved in something like, through which of our children will the Abrahamic covenant be renewed? In other words, if I want to trick my dad into giving me more money, I don't think this account of Jacob actually justifies me at all. Of course, even if we conclude that Jacob was not wrong to deceive in this case, that does not mean we're concluding that Jacob, or any other prophet, is flawless. We all know that prophets are human and commit sins and mistakes. They acknowledge as much. But it does not follow from this that we can simply infer sins or otherwise use speculative examples to make the point that prophets are imperfect. Well, I think the scriptures are clear that not all lying is a sin. But I'm not trying to convince you that Jacob's act wasn't a sin. It won't shake my faith if it was or was not. But I wanted to present these counterpoints to the common reading for your consideration. Let's move on to our second question, which is, if I think that Jacob did sin, and reason therefore that prophets are imperfect, does that in fact cast doubt on later First Presidency's declarations? I think there are 6 boxes that each need to be checked to connect the dots between Jacob's personal sin, if it was one, and a later First Presidency declaration. These points largely overlap with the considerations we outlined in our other video about the 116 pages. So we'll be brief here. First, if we assume for argument's sake that Jacob's act was a sin, one question is, how bad are the consequences of this sin really? In the case of the 116 pages, Joseph Smith actually ended up translating from plates that, quote, throw greater views upon my gospel, end quote. That's not so bad. Here, it seems, from the Lord's revelation to Rebekah, that Jacob was supposed to receive the blessing. Again, I'm not saying the ends necessarily justify the means. I'm only saying that I can't tell what the negative effects were of this sin, if it was one. And that's relevant when people cite this to support their accusation that the brethren do make serious mistakes with long-term consequences. Second, the Lord's response. There is no evidence of the Lord rebuking Jacob or putting an asterisk on Jacob's words or later prophets' words. If it was a sin, Jacob must have repented because Jacob has profound spiritual experiences afterwards. In Genesis 28, Jacob sees and converses with the Lord in a dream. In Genesis 31, the angel of God spake unto him in a dream. In Genesis 32, angels of God met him. And Jacob testifies that he has, quote, seen God face to face, end quote. In Genesis 35, God appears and speaks with Jacob again. Even if it was a sin, I feel compelled to be cautious in my passing judgment, given that Jacob's way of living the gospel, unlike mine, qualified him to visitations by angels and seeing God face to face. Third, inconsistent application. If Jacob's lie is a basis to distrust or disregard one First Presidency statement, why wouldn't it apply to all First Presidency statements? Can I just adhere to the ones that I personally like, and for those that I personally don't like, set them aside and blame Jacob for it? This thinking, to me, seems to devolve into the Cafeteria Approach to obedience, against which President Nelson has warned us.
Warn them that they will encounter people that pick which commandments they will keep and ignore others that they choose to break. I call this the Cafeteria Approach to obedience. This practice of picking and choosing will not work. It will lead to misery.
Fourth, sin versus teaching. It's of course true that an imperfect mortal can teach false doctrine or true doctrine, but personal imperfection doesn't imply doctrinal error. After all, most of our scriptural canon consists of accounts of people who have sinned. Joseph Smith distinguished between his personal sins and false teachings. Quote, "I never told you I was perfect, but there is no error in the revelations which I have taught." End quote. Fifth, there's a difference between a person's behavior as a prophet and their behavior before they were called as a prophet. Alma and Paul are among those that committed serious sins before their calls. Yet all of us, including those who accuse Jacob as a bad example liar, still cite Alma and Paul's teachings. Jacob's accusers do not disqualify Alma and Paul or cite them as examples of prophets making serious mistakes, presumably because their serious sins occurred before their conversion. But the same seems to be true for Jacob. The record of him seeing angels, seeing the Lord, being called, all occur after Jacob obeyed his mom in deceiving his dad. The account of Jacob's deceit may not be an example of a prophet's actions, but an example of a future prophet's actions. Paul and Alma, among others, make it clear that those are not the same thing. Lastly, counsels. Even if I'm convinced that this was a serious sin with serious consequences, that the Lord was displeased with Jacob, that I can decide which teachings are tainted by this, that Jacob's sin isn't excused just because it happened before his call. Even then, we need to bear in mind that the church is led today by unanimous decision of 3 prophets, often joined by 12 other prophets. Modern prophets repeatedly testify of the power and safety of councils. I'm not saying committees are perfect, but I do think the impact of councils, about which prophets have testified, cannot simply be ignored. To summarize, the conclusion that Jacob sinned by obeying his mom to deceive his dad is not a straightforward one. On the one hand, the scriptures are clear that there's a general commandment not to lie. On the other, the scriptures are also clear that there are exceptions. Because Jacob's situation is so unique, I can't find a clear scriptural precedent for it on either side. But when it comes to our judging whether Jacob sinned, it's worth weighing that his deceit was commanded by his mother, and she was acting to fulfill a revelation from the Lord. And she was Isaac's partner in the divine family order. Also, we should consider Isaac's subsequent blessing of Jacob and the Lord's 2 subsequent blessings of Jacob. Moreover, even if I think Jacob's deceit was a sin, to me, it's not nearly as simple as saying, I don't support such and such first presidency statement because Jacob lied, which proves prophets are imperfect. There's a huge gap between those, and I think all 6 of the points we discussed need to be addressed in order to span the chasm from here to there. Thank you for watching. We welcome any feedback. We hope this discussion is helpful in your study of the scriptures and the gospel of Jesus Christ.